When the courtroom doors burst open and 6 Border Patrol agents in full tactical gear stormed down the aisle, my father's attorney went pale. The single document I pulled from my jacket pocket that day didn't just save my inheritance. It exposed a secret my family had been hiding for decades. My own brother, who had just testified that I was mentally unfit to own property, watched in stunned silence as the lead agent approached the judge's bench. What they revealed next would shatter everything my wealthy family thought they knew about the land they were trying to steal from me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and 6 months ago, I was sitting in the back of a Border Patrol vehicle, watching the Arizona desert stretch endlessly toward Mexico. The radio crackled with coordinates and code names while my partner Carlos checked our GPS for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. We were hunting human traffickers, but I had no idea that the most dangerous predators in my life were waiting for me back home in Scottsdale. I grew up in Paradise Valley, where the houses have gates, and the driveways are longer than most people's streets. My father, Robert Rodriguez, built his empire developing luxury resorts and shopping centers across the Southwest. My mother, Patricia, made partner at one of Phoenix's most prestigious law firms before she turned 40. They created a world where success was measured in square footage and bank statements, where image mattered more than integrity. From the time I could walk, the path was laid out for me like an expensive Persian rug. Elite private schools, summer internships at my father's company, a business degree from Arizona State, followed by a comfortable position in the family empire. My older brother Daniel had followed this blueprint perfectly, graduating from law school and immediately joining my mother's firm. He drove a BMW, lived in a downtown Phoenix penthouse, and dated Amanda Chen, an investment banker whose family owned half of Camelback Mountain. But that carefully constructed future began to crumble on a sweltering August afternoon when I was 26. I was supposed to be reviewing construction permits for my father's latest project, a mega resort in Sedona that would bring him millions. Instead, I found myself staring at my computer screen, paralyzed by a suffocating sense of emptiness. The numbers on the spreadsheet blurred together as I realized I felt absolutely nothing about this work, this life, this version of myself that had been designed by committee. The phone call that afternoon came from my mother's secretary. My maternal grandfather, Miguel Santos, had died suddenly of a heart attack at his small ranch in Cochise County. I hadn't seen him in over 2 years, despite living only 3 hours away. My parents had always treated him like an embarrassing relic from a past they preferred to forget. He was a retired rancher who lived modestly, spoke more Spanish than English, and had the audacity to remind them where they really came from. The funeral was small, held at a weathered Catholic church in a town most people drive through without stopping. I sat in the front pew, overwhelmed by guilt for how little I knew about the man who had given me my mother's maiden name. After the service, his attorney, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Castillo, pulled me aside. My grandfather had left me his ranch, all 320 acres of it, along with a letter that would change everything. That evening I drove out to the property alone. The ranch house was modest, built from adobe and weathered wood, with a wraparound porch that faced the Dragoon Mountains. Inside, everything was exactly as my grandfather had left it. The walls were covered with old photographs, images of him as a young Border Patrol agent in the 1960s, pictures of my grandmother before she passed, and dozens of photos of desert wildlife. On his desk, I found the letter with my name written in his careful script. Elena, it began, "If you are reading this, then the land is yours now. This ranch has been in our family for over a century, but it means more than that. The desert here has seen things, kept secrets, protected people. I served 25 years with Border Patrol, and I know this land saved lives. Your parents never understood why I stayed here, why I never sold to developers. They saw empty desert where I saw sacred ground. I am leaving this to you because I believe you have the heart to understand what I could not explain to them." The letter went on to mention a metal box hidden beneath the floorboards of the barn, containing documents that told the full story of the land's history. I spent that night reading through papers that dated back generations, learning about underground railroad routes, safe houses for migrants, and my grandfather's secret work helping asylum seekers find sanctuary. The ranch wasn't just property, it was a lifeline that had saved countless lives. When I drove back to Scottsdale the next morning, I felt something I had never experienced before. Purpose. The hollow ache in my chest had been replaced by a burning certainty that this land, this legacy, was exactly what I had been searching for. I walked into my father's office and submitted my resignation from Rodriguez Development Group. The conversation that followed was swift and brutal. My father's voice was ice cold as he sat behind his massive oak desk, not even looking up from his computer. "You're making a mistake, Elena. That old man filled your head with romantic nonsense about that worthless piece of desert. Sell the land, take the money, and get back to building something real with your life." When I refused, his tone shifted to something darker. "That property is a liability. It's isolated, dangerous, and completely unsuitable for a young woman living alone. You'll come crawling back within 6 months." My mother's reaction was somehow worse. She scheduled an intervention disguised as a family dinner, complete with Amanda's parents and several family friends who had opinions about my mental state. Patricia Rodriguez, the sharp attorney who had never lost a case, spent 2 hours systematically dismantling my decision with the precision of a surgeon. She questioned my judgment, my stability, and my ability to manage such a responsibility. The message was clear. I was being irrational, emotional, and potentially dangerous to myself, but it was Daniel's betrayal that cut the deepest. My own brother, who had shared a childhood with me, who knew exactly how suffocating our parents' expectations could be, sided completely with them. He called my decision selfish and immature, claiming I was throwing away everything our family had worked to build. The final blow came when he suggested I needed professional help to deal with what he called my obvious mental breakdown. That night, I packed everything I owned into my pickup truck and drove back to the ranch. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone, but I had never felt more certain about anything. The desert sunrise that greeted me the next morning felt like a promise, and I was ready to discover what I was truly capable of becoming. The first 3 months at the ranch nearly broke me in ways I never anticipated. The isolation hit like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest during the long desert nights when the only sounds were coyotes calling across the vast emptiness. I had traded my climate-controlled office and daily Starbucks runs for a world where the nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away, and the internet connection worked sporadically at best. My hands, once soft from a lifetime of office work and manicures, developed calluses from fixing fence posts and repairing the ancient well pump that kept the property running. The house itself was a constant reminder of how unprepared I was for this life. Every morning brought new challenges that my expensive education had never covered. When the generator failed during a monsoon storm, I spent 6 hours in the dark trying to figure out why the backup power wouldn't start. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When a pack of javelinas broke through the garden fence my grandfather had built, I discovered that YouTube videos about wildlife management only got you so far when you were face to face with angry desert pigs at 5 in the morning. But the hardest part wasn't the physical challenges or even the crushing loneliness. It was the growing realization that I had no idea who I really was without the scaffolding of my family's expectations. For 26 years, I had been defined by what others wanted me to become. Now, stripped of titles and roles and carefully planned achievements, I felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Some nights, I would sit on the porch and wonder if my father had been right, if this was all just an elaborate form of self-destruction disguised as independence. The turning point came on a blazing October afternoon when I discovered I wasn't as alone as I thought. I was working on replacing rotted boards on the barn when I heard voices coming from the arroyo behind the property, Spanish voices, urgent and frightened. I grabbed my grandfather's binoculars and carefully made my way toward the sound, my heart hammering against my ribs. What I saw changed everything. A group of 6 people, including 2 small children, were huddled in the shade of a mesquite grove. They were clearly exhausted, their clothes torn and dusty from days of walking through the desert. The adults were sharing what looked like the last of their water while trying to comfort the crying children. These weren't the dangerous criminals my family's social circle talked about at dinner parties. These were families, desperate and terrified, who had risked everything for a chance at something better. I stood frozen for several minutes, torn between the urge to help and the fear of doing something wrong. Then I remembered the stories in my grandfather's documents, the tales of families he had guided to safety during his time with Border Patrol. This land had always been a sanctuary, and these people needed exactly what my grandfather had spent his life providing. I filled every water container I could find and carefully approached the group. The adults tensed when they saw me, ready to run despite their obvious exhaustion. Using my rusty high school Spanish, I tried to explain that I wanted to help. The relief in their eyes when they realized I wasn't going to call immigration was overwhelming. I brought them to the shade of the barn, gave them food and clean water, and used my grandfather's old radio to contact a humanitarian aid organization that could provide proper assistance. That night, after the aid workers had safely transported the family to a proper shelter, I sat in my grandfather's chair and understood for the first time what he had been trying to tell me in his letter. This wasn't just land. It was a responsibility, a calling that had been passed down through generations. The emptiness I had felt for so long began to fill with something I had never experienced before, purpose that came from something larger than myself. Over the following weeks, I found myself drawn deeper into the world my grandfather had inhabited. I reached out to the humanitarian organizations working along the border, volunteering to help with desert rescue missions. I learned about heat stroke and dehydration, about the signs of human trafficking and the protocols for reporting suspicious activity. Most importantly, I began to understand that the border wasn't just a line on a map, but a complex ecosystem of human drama, tragedy, and hope. It was during one of these volunteer shifts that I met Captain Maria Santos, a 30-year veteran of the Border Patrol, who had worked closely with my grandfather. She was a compact woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of person who commanded respect without ever raising her voice. When she learned I was Miguel's granddaughter, her stern expression softened into something approaching warmth. "Your grandfather saved my life once," she told me, as we sat in her truck overlooking a valley where smugglers frequently moved human cargo. I was a rookie agent, got separated from my partner during a pursuit. Miguel found me unconscious from heat exhaustion and carried me 6 miles to medical help. Never asked for recognition, never made it about himself. Just did what needed to be done. She studied my face with the intensity of someone who had spent decades reading people in high-stress situations. "You've got his eyes," she said finally. "Same fire underneath all that doubt. Question is, what are you going to do with it?" That conversation planted a seed that grew into an obsession. I began spending hours researching Border Patrol careers, reading about the training requirements and the reality of the job. The more I learned, the more certain I became that this was the path I had been searching for my entire life. It wasn't about proving anything to my family or rebelling against their expectations. It was about finding work that mattered, that made a real difference in the world. The decision crystallized on a December morning when I discovered human remains near the eastern boundary of the ranch. The bones were old, bleached white by years of desert sun, but they represented someone's family member who had died alone in pursuit of a better life. I spent that day helping the medical examiner and Border Patrol agents document the scene, and something inside me shifted permanently. I couldn't change what had happened to this person, but I could dedicate my life to preventing other families from experiencing this kind of loss. When I called my parents to tell them about my decision to apply for Border Patrol training, the conversation was even worse than I had anticipated. My father's voice was tight with barely controlled fury as he demanded to know if I had lost my mind completely. "You want to be a government employee?" he spat. "Making $30,000 a year to chase criminals through the desert? After everything we've invested in your education and your future?" My mother's response was more calculated and therefore more devastating. She approached my decision like a legal case she needed to win, systematically presenting evidence for why I was making a terrible mistake. "Elena," she said in her courtroom voice, "this is clearly a delayed reaction to grief over your grandfather's death. You're romanticizing his life because you're struggling to find your own identity." But throwing away your potential to play dress-up as some kind of border agent is not the answer. Daniel's reaction was swift and brutal. He called me that evening, his voice dripping with the condescension he had perfected during law school. "This is embarrassing, Elena. Do you know what people are saying about our family? First, you disappeared to live like a hermit in the middle of nowhere, and now you want to become a rent-a-cop with a badge? Dad's business partners are starting to ask questions about your mental state." But it was what he said next that revealed the depth of their concern. "Amanda and I have been talking to Mom and Dad about getting you some help. There are excellent private facilities in California where you could get the kind of professional support you obviously need. We all think it would be best if you took some time to focus on your mental health before making any more impulsive decisions." The threat was clear, wrapped in language of concern but unmistakably a declaration of war. They were prepared to have me declared mentally incompetent if I continued down this path. The family that had raised me, that claimed to love me, was willing to destroy my autonomy rather than accept that I might choose a life they couldn't control. That night, I sat on my grandfather's porch and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let their fear and prejudice define my future. If they wanted to treat me like an enemy, then I would stop trying to be their daughter and start becoming the person I was meant to be. The application for Border Patrol training was submitted the next morning, and I began preparing for a battle I never wanted, but was finally ready to fight. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had spent my entire life preparing me to be strong, successful, and independent. They had given me every advantage, every tool I needed to thrive in the world. They just never imagined I would use those gifts to build a life they couldn't understand or control. But as I watched the sun set over the desert that would soon become my classroom and my battleground, I knew I was finally heading in the right direction. The real Elena Rodriguez was about to emerge, and she was going to be everything my family had taught her to be, just not in the way they had planned. The Border Patrol Academy in Artesia, New Mexico was a shock to my system in ways I never could have anticipated. The dormitory room I was assigned felt smaller than my childhood walk-in closet, with cinder-block walls painted institutional beige and a single window that looked out onto an endless expanse of high desert scrubland. My roommate was a former Army mechanic from Detroit named Sarah Kim, who took one look at my expensive luggage and designer workout clothes and immediately dubbed me Princess. The first week nearly killed me. The physical training began at 5 in the morning with a 3-mile run that left me gasping and stumbling, while other recruits who had grown up doing manual labor jogged past me like they were taking a casual stroll. My hands, which had finally developed calluses from ranch work, now blistered and bled from rappelling exercises and firearms training. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, as instructors who seemed to have been carved from granite pushed us through obstacle courses designed to break the weak and forge the rest into something harder. But the physical challenges were nothing compared to the mental warfare. The instructors, led by a former Marine named Sergeant Torres, who had the unsettling ability to smell weakness from 50 yards away, seemed to take particular pleasure in dismantling everything you thought you knew about yourself. They stripped away every comfort, every assumption, every crutch you had relied on in civilian life, and replaced them with a new identity built on discipline, teamwork, and an absolute commitment to the mission. My privileged background made me an obvious target. During a particularly brutal day of desert survival training, Sergeant Torres pulled me aside after I had struggled for an hour to start a fire with primitive materials. He studied me with eyes that seemed to see right through my carefully constructed facade of determination. "Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you think this is summer camp for rich kids who want to play law enforcement? You think Daddy's money is going to help you when you're alone in the desert, with a family dying of thirst and no backup for 20 miles? The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they forced me to confront the truth I had been avoiding. I was exactly what he said I was, a privileged kid playing at being something I had never truly understood. My grandfather's legacy and my good intentions meant nothing if I couldn't prove myself when it mattered most. That night, I called Maria Santos from the payphone outside the dormitory. My voice was shaking with exhaustion and doubt, as I confessed that maybe my family had been right, maybe I was delusional to think I could do this job. Maria listened in silence until I finished my catalog of failures and fears. "Your grandfather called me once from a similar phone," she said finally, her voice carrying across the static-filled connection. It was his third week at the academy, back when they didn't even allow Hispanic agents to carry weapons. He was ready to quit because some instructor told him he'd never be anything more than a translator for the real agents. She paused, letting the parallel sink in before continuing. "You know what I told him? Same thing I'm telling you now. The badge doesn't make you an agent. Your background doesn't make you an agent. The only thing that makes you an agent is deciding every single day that you're going to earn it." Miguel understood that eventually. Question is, do you? The conversation changed something fundamental in how I approached the training. I stopped trying to prove I belonged and started focusing on actually belonging. I stayed up late studying Spanish phrases specific to border situations. I volunteered for extra physical training sessions. Most importantly, I began listening to my fellow recruits, learning from their experiences and building the kind of bonds that would be essential when we were deployed to the field. Jake Thompson, a soft-spoken rancher's son from Montana, taught me how to read animal tracks that could indicate human smuggling routes. Carlos Mendez, who had grown up in a Texas border town, shared stories about the subtle signs that distinguished desperate migrants from dangerous criminals. Sarah Kim, despite her initial skepticism about my motives, became my closest ally, helping me through the technical aspects of immigration law that came naturally to someone who had grown up around attorneys. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the months of training had turned my soft executive body into something lean and capable. The real change was deeper, in the way I moved through the world and thought about my role in it. I learned to trust my instincts in high-pressure situations, to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information, and to function as part of a team where individual glory meant nothing compared to collective success. The graduation ceremony was held on a scorching June afternoon, with families gathered under a massive tent to watch their sons and daughters receive their badges and swear their oath of service. I scanned the crowd, part of me still hoping to see familiar faces despite knowing better. My parents hadn't responded to my invitation, and Daniel had sent a text saying he was too busy with the case to attend. But Maria Santos was there, sitting in the front row in her dress uniform, her weathered face creased with pride. When my name was called and I walked across that stage to receive my badge, she stood and applauded, and for the first time in my life I felt the weight of earning something that truly mattered. After the ceremony, as I stood in my crisp new uniform with the silver badge gleaming on my chest, Maria pulled me aside for a private conversation. She handed me a small wrapped package that felt heavy in my hands. "This belonged to your grandfather," she said. "He asked me to give it to you if you ever followed in his footsteps." Inside was his old service weapon, a Glock 22 that showed the wear of years of faithful service. The grip was worn smooth from his hands, and there was a small scratch on the barrel that he had gotten during a rescue mission in the Sonoran Desert. But it was the note tucked into the holster that brought tears to my eyes. "Elena," it read in his careful handwriting, "this gun saved lives, not took them. Remember that the badge makes you a guardian, not a warrior. The desert will test you, but if you listen to it, it will also teach you. Make me proud." My first assignment was to the Tucson sector, one of the busiest and most dangerous areas along the entire border. The landscape was a brutal teacher, with temperatures that could kill in hours and terrain that swallowed people without a trace. But it was also heartbreakingly beautiful, full of hidden canyons and ancient petroglyphs that reminded you this land had been a crossroads of human migration for thousands of years. My training partner was Agent Luis Reyes, a 20-year veteran who had the rare ability to be both compassionate and completely professional in every situation. He taught me how to distinguish between the footprints of someone carrying drugs and someone carrying a child. He showed me the hidden water caches that humanitarian groups maintained for desperate travelers, and the less visible signs that indicated where smugglers moved their human cargo. Most importantly, Luis taught me that every encounter in the desert was a human story, not just a law enforcement statistic. The woman we found dying of dehydration near the Baboquivari Mountains wasn't just an illegal border crosser. She was a mother trying to reach her children who had been brought to Phoenix by their father. The teenage boy we arrested carrying 50 pounds of marijuana wasn't just a drug smuggler. He was a kid whose family had been threatened by cartels who gave him no choice but to carry their load or watch his sister disappear. The complexity of the border world was overwhelming at first, Every day brought situations that couldn't be solved with simple applications of law and procedure. I learned to navigate the delicate balance between enforcement and humanity, between protecting national security and preserving human dignity. It was exactly the kind of challenge that my expensive education had never prepared me for, but it was also exactly what I had been searching for my entire life. 3 months into my deployment, I received an unexpected visitor at the Tucson station. Daniel had driven down from Phoenix, claiming he wanted to see how I was doing in my new career. But the moment he walked into the break room, where I was writing reports, I could tell this wasn't a social visit. He looked around the utilitarian space with obvious distaste, taking in the government-issued furniture and the wall maps, marked with smuggling routes and rescue coordinates. His expensive suit and polished shoes made him look completely out of place among the practical gear and weathered faces of my colleagues. "Elena," he said, settling into a plastic chair with obvious reluctance, "we need to talk. Mom and Dad are worried about you. This whole situation has gone on long enough, and frankly, it's starting to affect Dad's business relationships. People are asking questions about why Robert Rodriguez's daughter is working as a border guard instead of taking her place in the family company." The words border guard were delivered with a sneer that made my blood pressure spike, but I kept my voice level as I responded. "I'm a federal law enforcement officer, Daniel, and I'm exactly where I choose to be." His expression shifted to the patronizing smile he had perfected during family arguments. "Look, I get it. You needed to prove something to yourself, and you've done that. But this phase of your life needs to end before it causes permanent damage to your future. Dad's willing to create a position for you at Rodriguez Development, something with real responsibility and a salary that matches your education." When I didn't immediately respond, he leaned forward, his voice taking on the urgent tone he used when closing business deals. "Elena, be practical. You're 28 years old. You need to start thinking about your real future. Marriage, children, building something meaningful with your life. This job is dangerous, and it's beneath you." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Daniel systematically presenting every argument my family had constructed for why I should abandon my new life and return to their carefully planned future. He spoke about financial security, social standing, and family reputation, as if these were the only factors that mattered in making life decisions. But what struck me most wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. Not once did he ask if I was happy. Not once did he inquire about the work I was doing or the lives I was affecting. Not once did he acknowledge that I might have found something valuable in this life he was so eager for me to abandon. When he finally left, driving his BMW back toward the manicured world of Scottsdale, I sat in the parking lot for a long time watching the desert sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The contrast between his world and mine had never been clearer, and for the first time since leaving home, I felt completely certain I had made the right choice. That certainty would be tested sooner than I imagined, as my family prepared to escalate their campaign to bring me back into line. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the vast beauty of the borderlands and the quiet satisfaction of work that truly mattered, I knew I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be. The real battle was just beginning, but I was no longer the same uncertain young woman who had fled to the desert to escape her family's expectations. I was Agent Elena Rodriguez, and I was ready for whatever came next. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, jarring me awake from dreams of desert pursuit and smuggling routes. The voice on the other end belonged to Agent Marcus Williams from the Phoenix field office, and the urgency in his tone immediately cleared the fog from my mind. "Rodriguez, we need you in Phoenix immediately. There's been a development regarding your ranch property that requires your immediate attention. I can't discuss details over an unsecured line, but pack a bag. You'll be staying in the city for several days." The drive north from Tucson to Phoenix gave me too much time to think, and not enough information to process. My mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Had someone discovered the historical documents my grandfather had hidden? Was there cartel activity on the property that I had somehow missed? The uncertainty gnawed at me as I navigated the pre-dawn darkness of Interstate 10, the lights of Phoenix growing brighter with each passing mile. The Phoenix field office was buzzing with activity despite the early hour. Agent Williams met me at the security checkpoint. his weathered face grim with the kind of expression that comes from 20 years of delivering bad news to people who weren't prepared to hear it. He led me through a maze of cubicles and briefing rooms to a secure conference area where several other agents were already assembled around a table covered with documents and photographs. "Elena," Williams said, settling into a chair across from me, "what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to process. We've been conducting a multi-agency investigation into a human trafficking operation that spans 3 states. The operation is sophisticated, well-funded, and has been running for at least 5 years. He slid a satellite photograph across the table toward me. It showed an aerial view of my ranch, but with details I had never noticed from ground level. There were tire tracks crisscrossing the eastern boundary, patterns that suggested regular vehicle traffic through areas I had assumed were pristine desert. Your property," Williams continued, "has been identified as a critical way station in this trafficking network. The location is perfect from their perspective, remote enough to avoid detection, but with access to major transportation corridors. We believe they've been using the ranch as a staging area for moving people and contraband toward Phoenix and beyond." The words hit me like a physical blow. My sanctuary, the place where I had found my calling and built my new identity, had been violated by the very criminals I had sworn to fight. Worse, I had been living there for over a year without detecting the activity that was apparently happening right under my nose. Agent Sarah Chen, whom I recognized from multi-agency briefings, leaned forward with a tablet displaying financial records. "Elena, we need you to understand that this isn't a reflection on your abilities as an agent or your vigilance as a property owner. These organizations are incredibly sophisticated. They study patterns, they know when properties are occupied and when they're not, and they're experts at using terrain to avoid detection." She scrolled through bank records and property transactions, highlighting patterns that told a disturbing story. "However, there's something else you need to know. We have evidence that suggests someone with intimate knowledge of your schedule and movements has been feeding information to the trafficking organization. Someone who knew when you were at work, when you were at training, when the property would be unoccupied." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Someone close to me, someone with access to my personal information, had been collaborating with criminals who were using my grandfather's sacred land for their evil purposes. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound I had ever experienced. Williams slid another document across the table, this one bearing an official seal and legal letterhead. 3 days ago, your family filed a motion in Maricopa County Superior Court requesting an emergency conservatorship over your property. They're claiming that you're mentally incompetent to manage the ranch due to what they're calling delusional behavior and poor judgment. I stared at the papers, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. My own family was using the legal system to steal my inheritance, while simultaneously providing information to criminals who were desecrating my grandfather's legacy. The coordination required for such an attack suggested planning that had been in motion for months, possibly since the day I first announced my intention to keep the ranch. The motion, Chen explained, cites several factors as evidence of your alleged incompetence. Your decision to leave a lucrative position in your father's company, your choice to pursue what they term a low-paying government job, and your refusal to develop or sell the property despite its potential commercial value. They're arguing that these decisions demonstrate a pattern of irresponsible behavior that puts the asset at risk. Williams opened another folder containing photographs that made my stomach lurch. These were surveillance images of the ranch taken during my absences, showing vehicles I didn't recognize parked near the barn, groups of people gathered in areas where I had never seen footprints, and equipment that had no legitimate purpose on ranch property. "The trafficking operation has been using your land for approximately 18 months, he said. They move groups through every few weeks, usually during your deployment cycles, when they know you'll be away for extended periods. They've established supply caches, communication equipment, and temporary holding facilities in areas of the property that aren't visible from the main house." The scope of the violation was overwhelming. While I had been working to protect the border and honor my grandfather's memory, criminals had been turning his land into a hub for the very activities he had spent his career fighting. The irony was bitter and complete. Agent Chen pulled up a timeline on her laptop, correlating dates of known trafficking activity with my work schedule and family interactions. Elena, the level of operational security they maintained suggests they had detailed intelligence about your movements. This wasn't random or opportunistic. It was a carefully planned exploitation of your property that required inside information. She highlighted phone records and email logs that painted a picture of coordination between unknown parties and someone with access to my personal information. We've identified several communication patterns that suggest the traffickers were receiving regular updates about your schedule, your duty assignments, and your plans for the property. The evidence pointed to a level of betrayal that was almost incomprehensible. Not only was my family attempting to steal my inheritance through legal manipulation, but someone in my inner circle had been actively collaborating with criminals who were using my land for human trafficking. Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression mixing professional concern with personal sympathy. Elena, there's something else. The conservatorship hearing is scheduled for this Friday. If your family succeeds in having you declared incompetent, they'll gain legal control of the ranch. Given what we know about the trafficking operation, we believe they intend to sell the property immediately to a development company that's already been identified as having connections to money laundering operations. The full scope of the conspiracy began to crystallize. This wasn't just about family disapproval or property disputes. This was a coordinated attack that involved legal manipulation, criminal collaboration, and the systematic destruction of everything my grandfather had built and protected. Chen slid a final document across the table, this one bearing the seal of a tourism federal judge. We've obtained a warrant to conduct a comprehensive investigation of the ranch and all parties involved in the trafficking operation. We'll be executing that warrant tomorrow morning. However, the timing creates a complication with the conservatorship hearing. Williams explained the legal complexity that threatened to derail the entire investigation. If the court grants the conservatorship before we complete our investigation, your family will have legal authority to restrict access to the property and potentially interfere with federal law enforcement operations. They could claim that any evidence we discover is inadmissible because it was obtained without proper consent from the legal property managers. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. My family's legal maneuver wasn't just about controlling my inheritance. It was designed to protect the trafficking operation by making it legally impossible for federal agents to gather evidence on the property. The conservatorship would provide perfect cover for cleaning up any traces of criminal activity before selling the land to developers who would erase the evidence permanently. Agent Williams stood and walked to a wall map displaying the entire trafficking network we had been tracking. Elena, we need your help to prevent this from happening. But I have to be completely honest with you about what that means. Fighting this conservatorship will require exposing yourself to public scrutiny, challenging your family in court, and potentially testifying about criminal activity on your property. He turned back to face me, his expression grave. Your family has resources, connections, and a legal team that specializes in this type of proceeding. They're going to attack your credibility, your mental state, and your fitness to manage property. They'll use your career choice against you, your decision to live alone on the ranch, and anything else they can find to paint you as unstable and irresponsible. The choice before me was stark and unforgiving. I could accept the conservatorship, surrender my grandfather's land, and watch as criminals erased his legacy while enriching themselves. Or I could fight, knowing that the battle would expose me to the full fury of my family's wealth and influence, while potentially jeopardizing the federal investigation that could bring the traffickers to justice. Chen closed her laptop and fixed me with a steady gaze. Elena, I want you to understand something. This investigation doesn't depend on your cooperation. We have enough evidence to proceed with or without your involvement. The question is whether you're willing to fight for your inheritance and your grandfather's legacy, knowing that the cost will be higher than anything you've faced so far. I sat in that sterile conference room, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and criminal conspiracy, and thought about my grandfather's letter. He had entrusted me with protecting the land because he believed I had the strength to understand what he couldn't explain to my parents. Now I understood completely. The ranch wasn't just property. It was a battleground where the forces of greed and corruption were trying to destroy everything good and sacred about the borderlands. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and clear. I'm not surrendering my grandfather's land to criminals and conspirators. Whatever it takes to fight this, I'm ready. Williams nodded. respect evident in his weathered features. Then we need to prepare for war. Because your family just declared it. And they have no idea what kind of enemy they've chosen to make. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on Friday morning, with reporters squeezed into every available seat and camera crews lined up outside the Maricopa County Superior Court building. My family had orchestrated this hearing like a carefully planned media event, ensuring maximum publicity for what they clearly expected to be my public humiliation and legal defeat. The irony was thick. They wanted witnesses to what they assumed would be my destruction, never imagining they were about to provide an audience for their own. Exposure. I sat at the defendant's table with my court-appointed attorney, a young public defender named Jennifer Walsh, who had been assigned to my case less than 24 hours earlier. Across the aisle, my family's legal team looked like they had stepped out of a corporate law firm advertisement. 3 attorneys in $1,000 suits, each carrying briefcases that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, flanked by my father, mother, and Daniel, all dressed in their finest courtroom attire. My parents wouldn't meet my eyes, but Daniel stared at me with an expression of smug satisfaction that made my blood boil. He had always enjoyed winning, but this was different. This was the look of someone who believed he was about to achieve total victory over an opponent who had dared to challenge the natural order of things. Judge Catherine Walsh, no relation to my attorney, was a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she had seen every possible variation of human greed and manipulation during her decades on the bench. She reviewed the case file with methodical precision, occasionally glancing up to study the packed courtroom with obvious displeasure. The lead attorney for my family, a sharp-faced man named Harrison who specialized in conservatorship cases, stood to present their opening argument. His voice carried the polished confidence of someone accustomed to winning cases through superior resources rather than superior facts. "Your Honor," he began, his tone dripping with practiced sympathy, "we are here today because a family is desperately trying to help a beloved daughter and sister who has lost her way. Elena Rodriguez, despite her privileged education and every advantage money could provide, has embarked on a pattern of increasingly erratic and self-destructive behavior that culminated in her abandonment of a promising career to pursue what can only be described as a fantasy of frontier law enforcement." He gestured toward a display board covered with photographs of my modest government salary statements, my Spartan living conditions at the ranch, and images of the dangerous terrain where I worked daily. "The evidence will show that Ms. Rodriguez has rejected every opportunity for success and stability offered by her loving family in favor of a dangerous delusion that has put both her life and her inheritance at risk." Harrison painted a picture of me as a mentally unstable woman living in isolation, making irrational decisions based on romanticized notions about a grandfather I barely knew. He presented financial projections showing how much money the ranch could generate if properly developed, contrasting those numbers with my government salary and sparse living conditions to suggest that only someone mentally impaired would choose such a life. The family's witnesses were a parade of character assassination disguised as concerned testimony. Family friends testified about my sudden personality change and abandonment of social connections. Former colleagues from my father's company described my erratic behavior and poor performance before I quit. Even a psychiatrist who had never met me offered an expert opinion about the psychological profile suggested by my life choices. Daniel's testimony was the most devastating, delivered with the practiced eloquence of a skilled attorney combined with the intimate knowledge of a brother who had observed my behavior for nearly 3 decades. He described my childhood struggles with family expectations, my academic failures, and what he characterized as a long pattern of rebellious behavior that had culminated in my current crisis. "She's always been the problem child, Your Honor," he said, his voice heavy with feigned sadness. "Our parents tried everything, private tutors, counseling, even allowing her to pursue her own interests when she showed no aptitude for business or law. But nothing worked. She's always been determined to make choices that hurt herself and embarrass our family." He went on to describe finding me living in squalor at the ranch, surrounded by dangerous wildlife and isolation that he claimed had clearly affected my mental state. When I expressed concern about her safety and tried to discuss more practical options for her future, she became hostile and irrational. It was clear that she was no longer capable of making sound decisions about her welfare or her property. My attorney Jennifer Walsh cross-examined each witness with the skill of someone who had spent years defending underdogs against overwhelming odds, but she was fighting an uphill battle against superior resources and home field advantage. The narrative my family had constructed was internally consistent and professionally presented, making my choices appear irrational to anyone who didn't understand the deeper motivations behind them. When it came time for my testimony, I stood and walked to the witness stand with my back straight and my head high, wearing my dress uniform with the same pride I had felt at my graduation ceremony. The courtroom fell silent as I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth, knowing that everything I said would be dissected and used against me. Jennifer Walsh guided me through my background, education, and the events that led to my career change, allowing me to present my side of the story in my own words. I described my grandfather's influence, my discovery of purpose through Border Patrol work, and my deep connection to the land that my family was trying to take from me. But it was during Harrison's cross-examination that the real battle began. He attacked every decision I had made, every choice that deviated from his narrow definition of success and rationality. He questioned my judgment, my stability, and my fitness to manage property or make important life decisions. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you abandoned a lucrative position in your family's successful business to become what amounts to a government security guard. Can you explain to the court how this represents rational decision-making?" I looked directly at him, my voice steady and clear. "I left that position because I found work that had meaning and purpose beyond profit margins. I became a federal law enforcement officer because I wanted to protect people and serve my country." Harrison pressed harder, bringing up my isolation, my modest income, and what he characterized as my obsession with a grandfather I had barely known. "But isn't it true, Ms. Rodriguez, that you're living alone in a remote location, cut off from family and friends, pursuing a romantic fantasy about border security while neglecting your real responsibilities?" That's when I decided to change the game entirely. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the document that Agent Williams had given me that morning. A federal warrant authorizing the search and seizure of evidence related to human trafficking operations on my property. "Your Honor," I said, standing and addressing Judge Walsh directly, "I request permission to present evidence that directly contradicts the characterization of my property management and decision-making abilities." The courtroom erupted in confusion as Harrison objected strenuously to the introduction of evidence that hadn't been disclosed during discovery. Judge Walsh studied the federal warrant with obvious surprise, her expression growing more grave as she read the details. "Mr. Harrison," she said finally, "your clients have characterized Ms. Rodriguez as an incompetent property manager whose poor judgment has put valuable land at risk. This federal warrant suggests that the property has indeed been at risk, but not due to Ms. Rodriguez's negligence." She looked directly at my family's legal team, her voice taking on an edge that suggested she was beginning to understand the true nature of what was happening in her courtroom. "I'm going to allow this evidence, and I'm going to hear testimony about the federal investigation that apparently prompted this warrant." Harrison's face went pale as he realized that the case he thought he had won was about to explode in spectacular fashion. He requested an immediate recess to consult with his clients, but Judge Walsh denied the motion with obvious irritation. The courtroom doors burst open at exactly that moment, and 6 Border Patrol agents in full tactical gear strode down the center aisle with the kind of presence that commanded absolute attention. The lead agent, someone I didn't recognize but who clearly outranked everyone in the room, approached the bench and handed Judge Walsh an official document. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, "I am Special Agent in Charge Robert Martinez with U.S. Border Patrol. We have a federal arrest warrant for Daniel Rodriguez in connection with conspiracy to aid human trafficking operations, obstruction of federal investigations, and money laundering through real estate transactions." The courtroom exploded into chaos as Daniel shot to his feet, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The agents moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding him and beginning the arrest process, while his attorneys shouted objections and demanded explanations. Agent Martinez continued his announcement, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. Our investigation has revealed that Mr. Rodriguez has been providing operational intelligence to criminal organizations using the ranch property as a trafficking way station. Phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance evidence demonstrate a pattern of collaboration that spans nearly 2 years. My father's face had gone ashen, and my mother appeared to be in genuine shock as the reality of the situation crashed down around them. Daniel was being handcuffed and read his rights while reporters frantically scribbled notes and camera crews outside captured every moment of what was rapidly becoming a media sensation. Agent Martinez turned to address Judge Walsh directly. Your Honor, we have evidence that this conservatorship proceeding was initiated specifically to interfere with our federal investigation and to facilitate the destruction of evidence related to ongoing criminal activities. The timing of this legal action correlates directly with our investigation timeline in ways that suggest coordination between the petitioners and the criminal organization we've been tracking. He opened a briefcase and began extracting documents that painted a picture of conspiracy far more complex and damaging than anyone in the courtroom had imagined. Daniel Rodriguez provided detailed information about his sister's work schedule, her deployment cycles, and her personal habits to facilitate criminal use of the ranch property. In exchange, he received payments disguised as legal consulting fees, totaling over $200,000. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Phone records showing regular communication between Daniel and known trafficking coordinators. Bank deposits that corresponded exactly with periods of increased criminal activity on my property. Even surveillance photographs that captured Daniel meeting with suspected traffickers in locations throughout Phoenix. But the most damaging revelation came when Agent Martinez presented evidence of the planned property sale. The development company identified as the intended purchaser of the ranch is a front organization for money laundering operations connected to the same trafficking network. The conservatorship was designed to legitimize the transfer of property that would then be used to clean millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. Judge Walsh listened to the federal presentation with growing incredulity, occasionally glancing at my family's legal team as the scope of their client's criminal activity became clear. When Agent Martinez finished his presentation, she turned to Harrison with an expression that could have frozen water. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "your clients have used my courtroom and the conservatorship process to further a criminal conspiracy involving human trafficking and money laundering. Not only is this petition denied, but I am referring this matter to the state attorney general for investigation of potential legal ethics violations." She looked directly at my parents, who sat in stunned silence as their carefully constructed world collapsed around them. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, you came into my courtroom claiming that your daughter lacked the judgment to manage property responsibly. The evidence suggests that she is the only member of your family who has demonstrated sound judgment and moral integrity." The hearing concluded with Daniel being led away in handcuffs while federal agents served additional warrants on my parents for their role in the conspiracy. The media circus outside was everything my family had wanted to avoid, but for entirely different reasons than they had anticipated. 3 months later, I stood on the porch of my grandfather's ranch, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The property had been cleared of all evidence of criminal activity, and federal agencies had installed security measures that would prevent future violations. More importantly, the land had been designated as a protected cultural site, ensuring that my grandfather's legacy would be preserved for future generations. Daniel was serving a 7-year federal sentence for his role in the trafficking conspiracy. My parents had avoided criminal charges but faced financial ruin as civil forfeiture proceedings stripped them of assets purchased with criminal proceeds. Their social standing in Scottsdale had evaporated overnight as the full scope of their family's criminal activity became public knowledge. The ranch had become exactly what my grandfather intended: a sanctuary and a place of honor where good people did important work protecting the innocent and vulnerable. I had been promoted to senior agent and assigned to lead a new task force focused on disrupting trafficking networks through community partnerships and intelligence sharing. But perhaps most importantly, I had discovered that true family isn't determined by blood or shared DNA. My real family consisted of the agents who trusted me with their lives, the humanitarian workers who shared my commitment to protecting migrants, and the memory of a grandfather who had believed in me when no one else would. The legal victory had vindicated every choice I had made and every sacrifice I had endured, but the real victory was deeper and more personal. I had proven to myself that integrity and purpose were worth more than wealth and social acceptance, that doing the right thing was always worth the cost, and that sometimes the greatest courage comes from walking away from everything you've been told you should want in order to find what you actually need. As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky, I raised a toast to my grandfather's memory with a cup of coffee made from beans grown on the mountains of Mexico. The border that divided nations couldn't divide the human spirit, and the land he had protected would continue to be a beacon of hope for generations to come. His granddaughter had kept the faith, fought the battle, and won the war that mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.